Over this entire course, we've tried to focus on how a series of decisions made by individuals create history. But sometimes, the crucial moments are decisions about an individual. That's exactly what happened to an enslaved man named Dred Scott in 1857. By bringing his case before the Supreme Court, he both claimed and asserted his rights as an American person in a system that, as we've seen, was not designed to recognize his personhood. After being unable to purchase freedom for his family, Scott and his wife Harriet filed a freedom suit in the Missouri Circuit Courts, where slavery was still legal, on the basis that they had lived in two free states and territories while moving around with their enslaver. The case would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court, where with the verdict of Scott v. Sanford, not only did the Supreme Court deny Scott his freedom, but it denied all Black people the rights to citizenship as well. Scott v. Sanford held that the federal government never had and never would have the ability to ban slavery in newly acquired territories. It illustrated Republicans' worst fears that slavery wasn't going anywhere anytime soon and was actually protected by a dominant slaveholding power in Congress, the White House, and now apparently the Supreme Court. And it disheartened the moderates in Congress who still hoped that a compromise over slavery was possible. It's often hard to pinpoint the first metaphorical domino that starts a chain of events, but this decision about Dred Scott's personhood could be one of them. In this episode, we'll see the debate about slavery escalate into a crisis both in Congress and in the Midwest, evolve into political secession, and then finally erupt into the American Civil War. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. In 1857, the U.S. president was Democrat James Buchanan. Before getting elected president, he was a senator from Pennsylvania, which was not a state that permitted slavery. But Buchanan was part of a faction in Congress known as the Doughfaces, an insult used for Northern politicians who favored Southern policies, because they supposedly let their morals get squished around by others, like dough. Buchanan ran for president supporting popular sovereignty, the idea that the people in each territory or state should decide whether they would allow slavery there. Buchanan also endorsed the Supreme Court's decision in Scott v. Sanford, saying all agree that under the Constitution, slavery in the states is beyond the reach of any human power except that of the respective states themselves. And the first state during Buchanan's presidency that had to decide its stance on slavery through popular sovereignty was Kansas. We learned at the end of a previous episode that the residents of the state got pretty violent, leading to the nickname Bleeding Kansas. And Congress wasn't much better. On May 19, 1856, the Republican Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts took the Senate floor. Sumner was an outspoken abolitionist who blamed two people for Kansas coming in as a state allowing slavery: Stephen Douglas, an Illinois senator, and Andrew Butler, a South Carolina senator. On the Senate floor, Sumner got a little heated. He called Douglas a noisome, squat, and nameless animal, not a proper model for an American senator. And he claimed Butler was having an affair with the harlot slavery. 3 days later, on May 22nd, a representative named Preston Brooks, who was distantly related to Butler, marched into the Capitol building and hit Sumner in the head with his metal-tipped cane. And then Brooks continued hitting Sumner until the Massachusetts senator went unconscious. The caning of Sumner, as it was called, revealed to the country just how hostile tensions over slavery had become. Not only were white people shedding blood in Kansas and Nebraska, but now there was violence in the halls of Congress. Look, we're gearing up for a war, so people are getting rowdy. In the meantime, the conflict over both slavery and the process for how decisions about slavery would be made continued. Without participation from anti-slavery settlers, who thought the process unfair, Kansans created a pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution in October 1857. Buchanan was unable to force it through Congress because many, including Stephen Douglas, thought it was illegitimate due to the way it was created. Kansans eventually voted again, this time with anti-slavery settlers taking part, and the Lecompton Constitution was rejected. But the amount of time and political attention that went into it further shows how big the debate around slavery had become by the late 1850s. In the meantime, a new leader of the Republican Party was emerging, a man whose face you can see on every penny and $5 bill: Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln started his time in politics as a Whig. He served 2 years in the House of Representatives between 1847 and 1849. In 1856, Lincoln joined the newly formed Republican Party. And in 1858, he ran against Stephen Douglas to be Senator of Illinois. Yes, the same noisome and squat Stephen Douglas, who was an Illinois senator during the caning of Sumner. The two men had very different political careers up to that point and had very different views on the institution of slavery. Douglas was a proponent of popular sovereignty, that idea that each territory or state should decide whether they would allow slavery. Many Democrats, like Buchanan, tended to be on board with the idea. On the other hand, Lincoln was a big opponent of the expansion of slavery, and he found the institution morally repugnant. But let's be clear, Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist yet. He believed slavery put the Union in danger, as he said in his famous House Divided speech. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln's ultimate goal was preserving the United States. If he could do it by eradicating slavery, so be it. But if he had to keep slavery to preserve the Union, he would. The Illinois Senate campaign between Douglas and Lincoln was heated. The pair engaged in 7 debates spread far and wide across the state, which were something like sports events today. Thousands of mainly white male spectators showed up to hear both men forcefully defend their positions on various issues, including slavery. And even though Douglas ended up winning the Senate race in 1858, thanks to the improvements in press and transportation that we discussed in a previous episode, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were transcribed, printed, and spread throughout the country. Lincoln was a relative nobody compared to the mighty Douglas, but he became a hero to the Republican Party for his ability to articulate the Republicans' platform. Another speaker who was elevated in papers and on the national stage was Frederick Douglass. He was born into slavery in either 1817 or 1818 and escaped in 1838 while aided by his future wife, Anna Murray, a free black woman. After escaping, Douglass spent his life fighting for abolition. He was a brilliant writer and orator, and he became one of the country's most sought-after speakers. His memoir, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, describes the brutality and injustice of slavery and its corrupting effects on slaveholders and the entire nation. It's a work of literature, a political statement, and an autobiography all at once, and it sold 5,000 copies within 4 months, an instant bestseller of the day. In 1859, the abolitionist John Brown was fresh off of fighting in Bleeding, Kansas, and invited Douglass to participate in a revolt that would hopefully lead to the end of slavery. Brown, along with a band of 22 men, planned to raid the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Frederick Douglass declined to participate, calling it a suicidal mission and one that wouldn't truly help enslaved Black Americans. But Brown went forward with the plan anyway. From October 16th to October 18th, 1859, the Harper's Ferry Armory was taken from the 90-ish Marines tasked with guarding it. But rather than ignite a bigger society-changing revolt, Brown was captured and executed by the state of Virginia. Douglas's prediction ended up being right. Again, we see both vocal opposition and tensions spilling over into actual bloodshed over the issue of slavery. Crisis was brewing throughout the nation, which brings us to the hotly contested and complicated election of 1860. We've talked about a few different elections in this series that shattered the norms and started a new era of politics. With an unstable party system brought on by the end of the Whig Party and the rise of the Republicans, 1860 is one of those. There were 4 big names in this election. Abraham Lincoln was running as a Republican against his Illinois-based rival Stephen Douglas, the Democrat. Then there was another Democrat named John C. Breckinridge and a third-party candidate named John Bell, who ran for the Constitutional Union Party and whose platform was basically, please, pretty please, let's preserve the Union. To understand what the American people were dealing with, it's helpful to think of this election in 2 parts, the northern part and the southern part. In the North, Lincoln and Douglas competed head-to-head for votes. The pro-slavery Bell and Breckinridge didn't even bother campaigning. In the South, a 3-way race was emerging between Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. Because of that, Lincoln didn't even bother campaigning down there. Ultimately, the North had an electoral college advantage over the South, and Lincoln won the election without a single Southern vote. And that made plenty of people furious. In the 5 months between Lincoln's election night and Inauguration Day, 7 states seceded from the Union explicitly because of the slavery issue. Secession was an idea originally credited to John C. Calhoun back in 1828, based on the doctrine of nullification created by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the 1790s. Calhoun believed that states could nullify or block certain federal laws that a state believed went against its interest. And the greatest extent of nullification was secession, which happened when a state severed itself from the Union entirely. The constitutional grounds for secession were dubious. Nonetheless, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded and released statements about how they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Ultimately, it's hard to discuss an impending war as a net good for a country. But as we saw in the past few episodes, the Civil War did not begin the violence. Slavery itself was an endlessly violent institution that took lives and tore families apart, and disagreements about slavery in and out of the US government were turning bloody too. At this point, in 1860, any compromise would have preserved or even expanded slavery. War, on the other hand, would turn out to end it, though no one knew that at the start. Is war tragic? Yes. But was a peace that included racial slavery also tragic? Yes, it was. What's about to unfold over the next 2 episodes is one of those gray areas in history, and as historians, it's our job to take and evaluate the evidence we have. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.